On the night of August 2nd, 1934, Germany did not erupt in riots or gunfire. There were no tanks in the streets, no public executions, no visible coup. Yet that night marked one of the most decisive transformations in modern political history. President Paul von Hindenburg was dead. Within hours, power in Germany was no longer divided. The offices of President and Chancellor were merged into one. And the German armed forces, men trained to obey the state, the Constitution, and the law, were ordered to swear a new oath. Not to Germany, not to the Constitution, not to the people, but to one man, Adolf Hitler. The oath was short, precise, and devastating in its implications. I swear by God this sacred oath, that I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, Führer of the German Reich and people, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and that I will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. For the first time in modern European history, loyalty itself was ritualized, stripped of legal abstraction, and bound to a living individual. This was not an accident. It was not tradition. It was design. Before 1934, German military oaths followed a familiar pattern. Soldiers swore loyalty to the state and its laws. The oath functioned as a legal agreement, conditional, institutional, theoretically reversible. The new oath erased that logic. It was personal, it was absolute, and it was framed not as a legal promise, but as a sacred vow. The word unconditional was not rhetorical. It removed moral discretion. The phrase, ready to risk my life at any time, erased future doubt. And the invocation of God transformed obedience into something dangerously close to religious duty. From that moment forward, disobedience was no longer merely illegal. It was profane. Nowhere was this transformation more visible or more terrifying than within the SS. To the outside world, the SS appeared to be an elite military force. Internally, it was something else entirely. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, the SS was deliberately shaped as a secular order, modeled loosely on medieval knightly brotherhoods and stripped of Christian ethics. Himmler did not want soldiers who obeyed out of discipline. He wanted men who believed they were bound. Initiation ceremonies were often held at night. Torchlight replaced daylight. Symbols replaced explanations. The oath was not always shouted in public squares. In many cases, it was spoken quietly, in enclosed spaces, among peers, surrounded by insignia that carried meanings never explained aloud. The effect was intentional. Ritual does not require understanding. It requires submission. Modern psychology helps explain why these oaths were so effective. But the Reich did not need psychology textbooks. It relied on instinct and tradition. A spoken oath creates commitment pressure. A public oath creates social captivity. A sacred oath creates internal enforcement. Once spoken, the oath could not be taken back. There was no exit clause, no mechanism for moral appeal. Former SS men would later describe the moment of the oath not as inspiring, but as final. One post-war interrogation record includes a chilling admission. After the oath, I no longer asked myself whether something was right. I asked only whether it was expected. This was the true power of ritual. It did not command behavior. It replaced conscience. The Reich understood something ancient. Loyalty becomes stronger when it is materialized. Words alone fade. Objects endure. Within the SS, ritual loyalty was reinforced through symbolic artifacts, rings, daggers, insignia, that were not simply decorations, but tokens of belonging. The most infamous of these was the Totenkopf ring, a silver band engraved with a skull, runic symbols, and a personal inscription from Himmler himself. It was not owned by the wearer, it was loaned. When an SS officer died, or fell from favor, the ring was returned to the SS leadership, often stored in special locations tied to Himmler's personal myth-making. The message was clear. You did not possess your loyalty. It possessed you. Desertion existed in every army. But within the SS, breaking the oath carried a different weight. Men who attempted to leave did not describe fear of punishment alone. They described fear of betrayal, not of comrades, but of something internalized and absolute. This is why so many later insisted they had no choice. Legally, that claim was false. Psychologically, it was devastatingly true. The oath created a prison without walls. By the late 1930s, the Reich no longer relied solely on laws to maintain obedience. It relied on belief systems masquerading as loyalty. When war came, men did not march only because they were ordered to. They marched because they had promised. And when atrocities followed, the question was no longer should I. It was can I break what I swore? Most could not. The Third Reich did not invent oaths. It weaponized them. It understood that when loyalty stops being conditional, it stops being moral. And when ritual replaces law, obedience becomes automatic. The Reich did not rule by command alone. It ruled by binding men to promises they could never undo. That is where the story begins. Before the Third Reich, German soldiers did not swear loyalty to a man. They swore loyalty to a state. Under the German Empire and later the Germany of the Weimar Republic, military oaths were legal instruments. They bound soldiers to the Constitution, to the laws of the land, and to the abstract idea of national service. The wording varied over time, but the principle remained stable. Obedience existed within a framework of institutions. Authority was impersonal. In theory, it could be challenged, transferred, or redefined. That framework collapsed quietly, not through violence, but through language. When Adolf Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, the German military remained cautious. The Reichswehr leadership did not fully trust him. Many officers still viewed National Socialism as a political movement that would pass, as others had before. At this stage, Hitler did not yet control the army. He needed something stronger than decrees or propaganda. He needed loyalty that could not be renegotiated. The opportunity came in August 1934, with the death of President Paul von Hindenburg, the last figure capable of balancing Hitler's power. The same day Hindenburg died, Hitler issued a decree merging the offices of President and Chancellor. More quietly, but far more consequentially, the Ministry of Defense introduced a new oath for the armed forces. There was no parliamentary debate, no public referendum, no constitutional amendment. The oath was simply ordered. And from that moment on, the German soldier no longer pledged obedience to Germany. He pledged unconditional loyalty to the Führer himself. This change may appear symbolic. It was not. Legal scholars later noted that the oath fundamentally altered the relationship between soldier and state. A constitution can be violated, a law can be reinterpreted, but a personal oath, especially one framed as sacred, transforms obedience into a moral absolute. It bypasses legal reasoning and embeds authority inside the individual conscience. The Reich understood this instinctively. By removing the state as the object of loyalty and replacing it with a living leader, responsibility became blurred. Orders no longer came from institutions that could be questioned or replaced. They came from a figure portrayed as the embodiment of the nation's destiny. Disobedience ceased to be a legal matter. It became a personal betrayal. This distinction would later prove catastrophic. The wording of the oath was carefully constructed. It invoked God, sacrifice, and permanence. The soldier was not asked to obey laws or defend borders. He was asked to submit himself, entirely and without condition, to one man's will. The oath did not define limits. It did not allow for conflict between conscience and command. It demanded readiness to die, not for a principle, but for a person. Historians often describe this as a political maneuver. That description understates its impact. What the Reich created was not a contract, but a binding ritual. In traditional legal systems, loyalty is transactional. The state demands obedience, but it also promises protection, rights, and continuity. The Nazi oath severed that reciprocity. It demanded everything and promised nothing beyond belonging. This shift was deliberate. Hitler had studied the failures of the German Empire in 1918. He believed the collapse had not been military, but psychological, a failure of belief and unity. In his view, soldiers had lost faith in leadership, not in the nation itself. The solution, therefore, was not better strategy, but unbreakable loyalty. And loyalty, when fused with ritual, becomes self-enforcing. By the mid-1930s, oath ceremonies were increasingly stylized. While the official Wehrmacht oath was often administered formally, its repetition, drilled into recruits, recited publicly, reinforced in speeches, gave it a quasi-liturgical quality. Words were memorized, not debated. The act of speaking mattered more than understanding. For elite formations, this process went further. Within the SS, loyalty was never treated as a legal necessity. It was cultivated as a form of initiation. New members were not merely enrolled, they were symbolically separated from civilian society. Their oath marked a transition, from individual to instrument. This distinction explains why, even after Germany's defeat, many former SS members insisted they had remained loyal, not because they feared punishment, but because breaking the oath felt psychologically impossible. The ritual had done its work. What made these oaths especially powerful was their timing. They were often administered at moments of vulnerability: early adulthood, intense training, social isolation, and constant ideological reinforcement. The oath became the emotional anchor in an unstable environment. To question it was to question one's entire identity. The Reich exploited this dynamic relentlessly. The oath was repeated, referenced, glorified. It appeared in speeches, ceremonies, and commemorations. Fallen soldiers were praised not for defending Germany, but for remaining faithful to their vow. Death itself was reframed as proof of loyalty fulfilled. In this way, the oath ceased to be a single moment. It became a permanent psychological state. Crucially, the system also removed alternatives. There was no legitimate path for withdrawal. To renounce the oath was to renounce honor, comradeship, and belonging. Even doubt was treated as weakness. Silence became complicity. Complicity became routine. By the time the war began in 1939, millions of men had internalized a loyalty that no longer depended on laws or outcomes. Victory was no longer required to justify obedience. The oath itself was sufficient. This is why the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945 did not immediately dissolve its internal bonds. Long after Hitler was dead, former soldiers struggled to articulate why they had continued to obey orders that clearly violated moral norms. Many returned to the same phrase, again and again: "I had sworn an oath." That sentence was not an excuse. It was a confession. The transformation of the military oath was not a footnote in Nazi history. It was a foundation. It marked the moment when obedience stopped being conditional and became sacred, when loyalty ceased to serve the state and began to consume the individual. The Reich did not merely command its soldiers. It rewired them. And once loyalty became a ritual, it no longer needed enforcement. It enforced itself. If the Wehrmacht oath transformed obedience into a personal bond, the SS took the next step. It removed obedience from the realm of politics altogether and placed it inside something closer to belief. From its earliest expansion after 1933, the SS was never intended to function like a conventional military force. Its internal documents, training manuals, and leadership correspondence reveal a different ambition. The SS was conceived as a community of the bound, a body held together not by law or career advancement, but by shared ritual, myth, and irreversible commitment. This vision came directly from Heinrich Himmler, who saw himself less as an administrator and more as the architect of a new elite order. Himmler was not a charismatic speaker or battlefield commander. His power lay in structure. He believed that modern states failed because they relied too heavily on rational systems that could be questioned, criticized, or dismantled. What endured, he believed, were belief systems. The SS was his experiment in engineered belief. Recruitment was selective, but selection alone was not enough. Entry into the SS required transformation. New members were subjected to ideological instruction that framed the organization as something ancient, reborn, a continuation of a mythical Germanic lineage, purified and restored. Christianity was not formally banned, but it was quietly displaced. Moral authority no longer flowed from religion or law, but from the order itself. The oath marked the threshold. Unlike standard military ceremonies, SS oath rituals were designed to be emotionally disorienting. Many were conducted at night, illuminated by torches rather than electric light. Darkness limited visual reference points. Fire created movement and shadow. The setting was not accidental. Anthropologists would later recognize the structure immediately: separation, liminality, reintegration. The initiate was separated from civilian identity, placed in a symbolic void, then reintroduced as something new. The words of the oath were simple, but their framing was not. Loyalty was not described as service. It was described as destiny. The initiate did not pledge to perform duties. He pledged to belong. The Führer was invoked not as a political leader, but as the living axis of the community. Himmler understood that belief does not require complexity. It requires repetition and emotional charge. The oath was therefore reinforced constantly. SS men encountered it in ceremonies, in speeches, in internal publications. It was referenced at weddings, funerals, and promotions. It followed members from initiation to death. Crucially, the oath was never contextualized as temporary. Military service ends. Careers conclude. Governments fall. The SS oath did not acknowledge any of these possibilities. This omission mattered. By refusing to imagine an endpoint, the oath positioned itself outside of time. Loyalty was no longer linked to outcomes. It existed independently of success or failure. Victory was desirable, but not necessary. What mattered was fidelity. Within this framework, obedience became moral proof. Actions were not judged by their content, but by their alignment with loyalty. A command issued from above carried inherent legitimacy, not because it was legal or rational, but because it originated from the source of the oath. To question it was to question the binding itself. This logic explains why SS units could be deployed across radically different functions: policing, administration, mass murder, without internal fracture. The moral evaluation of tasks was irrelevant. The task existed because the order existed. The order existed because loyalty demanded it. Himmler reinforced this worldview through symbolism. The SS was saturated with runes, insignia, and ceremonial language deliberately disconnected from modern legal or religious frameworks. Symbols were never fully explained. Ambiguity was a feature, not a flaw. What mattered was not understanding, but submission. Belief thrives in spaces where explanation is withheld. By the late 1930s, the SS had become something rare in modern history. A bureaucratic organization operating on quasi-religious principles. It had ranks, files, and procedures, but its core cohesion came from ritualized loyalty. Members were encouraged to view themselves as guardians of an invisible order, standing apart from ordinary society. This separation was psychological as much as social. SS men lived, trained, and worked among each other. Their identity narrowed. Alternative moral frameworks faded. The oath filled the vacuum. The effects were measurable. Post-war interviews and interrogations repeatedly show that SS personnel struggled to articulate personal responsibility. Many described themselves as actors inside a structure they could not leave, bound by a promise that felt more real than law. One former officer stated during questioning in 1947 that disobedience felt unthinkable, not because of fear of punishment, but because it would have meant the collapse of everything that gave meaning to my service. That statement was not unique. The SS did not rely primarily on terror to maintain obedience. Terror existed, but it was secondary. The primary mechanism was internalization. Members policed themselves. Doubt was suppressed before it reached language. The oath did not need to be enforced daily. It lived inside the individual. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the SS had fully achieved Himmler's objective. It was an organization in which loyalty functioned as belief, belief functioned as identity, and identity functioned as control. This is why the SS could survive, psychologically, even as Germany collapsed around it. Long after the state disintegrated, the oath remained intact in the minds of many who had sworn it. The external structure was gone. The internal bond endured. The transformation of loyalty into religion did not require churches, scriptures, or theology. It required only one thing: a promise that could not be undone. And the SS made that promise sacred. Rituals do not survive on words alone. They require substance, something that can be touched, worn, returned, or taken away. The SS understood this with unsettling clarity. While the public image of Nazi loyalty focused on speeches and banners, the internal system relied on objects. These objects were not rewards. They were anchors. Each one carried a message. Loyalty was not an idea you held. It was something that marked you. At the center of this system stood a simple principle: belief becomes stronger when it is made physical. Within the SS, ritual objects served as constant reminders that loyalty was permanent, monitored, and never fully owned by the individual. Daggers, rings, insignia, even handwritten inscriptions were used not merely to signify rank, but to reinforce belonging. They functioned as silent witnesses to the oath. The most infamous of these objects was the SS honor ring, commonly known as the Totenkopf ring. It was not mass-produced like medals. It was issued selectively, often accompanied by a personal dedication signed by Heinrich Himmler himself. The design was deliberately stark: a skull, runic symbols, and inscriptions tied to the bearer's identity within the order. What made the ring extraordinary was not its appearance, but its rules. The ring was never truly owned by the recipient. Officially, it remained the property of the SS. When an officer died, the ring was to be returned. When an officer was dismissed, disgraced, or expelled, the ring was confiscated. It could not be passed down. It could not be sold. It could not remain with the family. Even in death, loyalty was reclaimed. This practice was not symbolic courtesy. It was ideological enforcement. The message was unmistakable. Your identity within the SS existed only as long as your loyalty remained intact. The moment it ended, by death or betrayal, the symbol was withdrawn. Belonging was conditional, but the oath was not. The physical act of returning the ring carried ritual weight. Records indicate that many recovered rings were sent to centralized storage locations associated with Himmler's own mythological vision of the SS. These were not armories. They were treated as repositories, almost reliquaries, for objects imbued with meaning. The implication was chilling. Loyalty outlived the individual. Blood played a quieter, but equally potent role. While popular culture often exaggerates explicit blood rituals, documented practices show something subtler and more effective. The SS did not rely on theatrical bloodletting. It relied on symbolic blood logic: ancestry, sacrifice, lineage, and irreversible commitment. Blood was invoked constantly in language. Blood determined eligibility. Blood explained hierarchy. Blood justified exclusion. In this context, the oath itself became a form of blood bond. Not through physical wounds, but through the idea of shared essence. To swear loyalty was to declare oneself part of a living chain, extending backward into imagined history and forward into an undefined future. Objects reinforced this illusion. SS daggers bore mottos that framed obedience as honor. Uniforms were designed to separate the wearer visually and psychologically from civilian society. Even everyday items carried inscriptions, reminding members that they were part of something permanent and indivisible. Importantly, these symbols were not optional. Refusal to accept them was interpreted as rejection of the oath itself. Wearing them was a daily recommitment. Each morning, loyalty was put on like a uniform. This constant reinforcement had a cumulative effect. Over time, symbols replaced reflection. Actions were no longer weighed against external moral systems. They were measured against alignment with the order. The object became a proxy for conscience. Post-war testimonies reveal how deeply this system penetrated. Former SS members frequently described their ritual objects with more emotional clarity than their actions. They remembered receiving the ring. They remembered the ceremony. They remembered the sense of being chosen. When asked about crimes, their accounts grew vague. When asked about symbols, they became precise. This imbalance is telling. The Reich did not merely issue symbols to decorate loyalty. It used them to displace responsibility. If the object represented belonging, then obedience became an act of preservation, not of law or humanity, but of identity. To disobey was to risk erasure, and erasure within a system built entirely on belonging was unthinkable. By embedding loyalty into physical form, the SS ensured that the oath was never abstract. It was worn, carried, returned, and reclaimed. It followed the individual everywhere. Even in silence, it spoke. This is how ritual outperforms ideology. Ideology can be argued with. Symbols cannot. They simply exist, demanding recognition, obedience, and continuity. By the time the war began, loyalty within the SS no longer required persuasion. It was reinforced every time a ring touched skin, every time a dagger was worn, every time a uniform was fastened. The oath lived not only in memory, but in matter. And matter does not forget. The effectiveness of the Nazi oath system did not rely on brutality alone. Terror existed, but it was not the primary mechanism. What made the system endure was something far more efficient: psychological engineering. The Third Reich understood that sustained obedience cannot be maintained by fear alone. Fear produces compliance, but it also produces instability, resistance, and eventual collapse. What the regime sought instead was internal control, a system in which individuals enforced obedience within themselves. The oath was the entry point. Modern psychology describes a phenomenon known as commitment escalation. Once a person makes a public, irreversible commitment, they become psychologically invested in justifying it, even when evidence contradicts their values. The Reich exploited this instinct decades before it was formally studied. By making loyalty absolute, sacred, and personal, the oath locked individuals into a cycle of self-rationalization. Once sworn, the oath created a mental boundary. Everything before it belonged to a different life. Everything after it had to be interpreted in a way that preserved the meaning of the vow. To admit that the oath was wrong would have meant admitting that one's identity had been built on a lie. Most people could not bear that. The system also relied heavily on temporal pressure. Oaths were often administered early, to young men, frequently isolated from civilian environments, immersed in training regimes designed to exhaust critical thought. The oath did not come after reflection. It came at the moment of vulnerability. This timing was crucial. It ensured that the oath became a foundation, not a conclusion. Once internalized, loyalty began to operate independently of supervision. Orders no longer required constant enforcement. The oath reframed obedience as self-preservation. Disobedience threatened not only external punishment, but internal collapse. To question an order was to reopen the oath. To reopen the oath was to risk losing coherence. This is why so many later described obedience as automatic. The oath also altered moral perception. Traditional ethics rely on comparison: right versus wrong, legal versus illegal, justified versus unjustified. The Nazi oath replaced this framework with a single axis: loyalty versus betrayal. Actions were no longer evaluated based on their impact, but on their alignment with fidelity. Within this structure, extreme behavior did not feel extreme. It felt necessary. The regime further reinforced this mechanism through group synchronization. Oaths were rarely sworn alone. They were spoken collectively, binding individuals into a shared psychological fate. Once bound, deviation became not only a personal risk, but a threat to group cohesion. Peer pressure intensified internal enforcement. Silence became agreement. Agreement became expectation. This created a closed moral loop. Inside that loop, dissent did not disappear. It became unthinkable. Not because individuals were incapable of doubt, but because doubt had no language. The oath did not provide a framework for moral conflict. It allowed only alignment or exclusion. Exclusion, in a system built entirely on belonging, was existential. The Reich also understood the power of irreversibility. There were no rituals for withdrawal, no ceremonies of release, no sanctioned way to reinterpret or end the oath. Once sworn, it existed outside time. Even death did not annul it. Death fulfilled it. This lack of exit was not an oversight. It was essential. Psychologically, humans endure extreme conditions more easily when they believe an endpoint exists. The oath removed that relief. There was no future moment when loyalty would be evaluated or renegotiated. It simply was, forever. Under these conditions, conscience did not disappear. It was overridden. Individuals learned to silence moral discomfort by reframing it as weakness, sentimentality, or betrayal. The oath provided a ready-made justification. Personal feelings were irrelevant. The promise mattered more. This explains why propaganda alone was insufficient. Propaganda persuades. The oath locks. By the time Germany entered full-scale war, millions of men had been conditioned to interpret reality through the lens of loyalty. Success validated the oath. Failure demanded greater fidelity. Even catastrophe did not dissolve the bond. It intensified it. This psychological structure proved tragically resilient. As the Reich collapsed, as cities burned and leadership fled, many remained loyal, not because they believed victory was possible, but because loyalty had become inseparable from selfhood. To abandon it would have meant facing the void beneath the oath. A life defined by submission without justification. Few were prepared to do that. The oath did not turn men into machines. It turned them into guardians of their own captivity. And systems built on internal enforcement are the hardest to dismantle. By the time the war ended, the Reich was gone. But for many who had sworn the oath, its grip remained, silent, invisible, and unbroken. Breaking a Nazi oath was not treated as a legal problem. It was treated as a collapse of being. For those who had sworn unconditional loyalty, the idea of withdrawal did not exist in any formal sense. There was no procedure, no appeal, no recognized moral exit. A man could desert his post, refuse an order, or flee, but he could not unswear the oath. That asymmetry defined everything that followed. In theory, desertion from the German armed forces carried severe penalties. In practice, the consequences varied depending on timing, location, and unit. But within the SS, the consequences were different in nature. Breaking the oath was not simply disobedience. It was betrayal of an internalized identity. Former SS members interviewed after the war struggled to describe this distinction. Many emphasized that fear of punishment was not the dominant factor. The deeper fear was something harder to articulate: the fear of becoming nothing. The oath had replaced earlier identities: civilian, professional, moral. It had narrowed the individual's sense of self to a single axis: loyalty. Once that axis was removed, nothing stable remained. This is why attempts to defect or disobey were often accompanied by profound psychological distress. Men did not simply run, they fractured. Historical records confirm this pattern. During the war, the number of SS personnel who openly defected or refused orders remained strikingly low, even as the military situation deteriorated. This was not because all SS members were fanatics. Many expressed private doubts. Some even voiced horror at what they witnessed. But doubt alone was not enough to overcome the internal barrier erected by the oath. When disobedience did occur, it was rarely framed as moral resistance. Instead, it appeared as exhaustion, illness, or reassignment. Men sought physical escape because psychological escape was unavailable. Those who attempted direct refusal often described a moment of paralysis. Post-war testimonies repeatedly reference an inability to speak. Orders were heard, understood, and internally rejected, but not verbally opposed. The oath intervened at the moment where language should have formed. One former officer described it as a wall inside the head. Another referred to it as a hand closing around the throat. These metaphors matter. They indicate that obedience was no longer experienced as choice. It was experienced as compulsion. The system reinforced this paralysis through social isolation. Units were structured to minimize contact with dissenting perspectives. Loyalty was continuously affirmed through ritual, repetition, and peer expectation. Even minor deviations were noted. Silence was observed. Tone was interpreted. The oath created an environment in which inner hesitation felt externally visible, even when it was not. This perceived visibility intensified self-censorship. Fear of punishment was real, but it was secondary. The primary mechanism was internal surveillance. Men monitored themselves. They learned to suppress doubt before it reached consciousness. Over time, this suppression became automatic. The oath no longer needed to be remembered explicitly. It operated in the background, shaping reactions before reflection could occur. This internalization explains a disturbing paradox observed after the war. When captured, many former SS members did not immediately deny their actions. Instead, they denied agency. They described themselves as carried by a structure, bound by promises, unable to step outside the logic of obedience. This was not always a strategy to avoid responsibility. In many cases, it reflected genuine confusion. They had never practiced disobedience. The oath had trained them to experience obedience as the only stable state. Breaking it felt less like an act of resistance and more like psychological annihilation. Even when the regime began to collapse, this dynamic persisted. As Allied forces advanced and defeat became inevitable, loyalty did not dissolve. In some cases, it intensified. Orders became more extreme. Resistance became rarer. The oath did not adapt to reality. It rejected it. This rigidity was lethal. There are documented cases of SS units continuing operations long after strategic purpose had vanished. Men fought, not because they believed in victory, but because the oath had removed the concept of retreat. Surrender was not interpreted as survival. It was interpreted as self-erasure. The few who did surrender often described the moment not as relief, but as disorientation. The oath had structured their perception of time and purpose. Without it, they experienced something close to vertigo. Some reported an overwhelming sense of shame. Others reported emptiness. A small number reported rage, directed not at the regime, but at themselves. The post-war period did not immediately resolve this conflict. During interrogations, many former SS members struggled to answer questions that assumed personal choice. When asked why they followed certain orders, they did not respond with ideological slogans. They responded with references to obligation, commitment, and promise. The language of law and morality felt foreign. The language of loyalty remained dominant. This linguistic persistence reveals how deeply the oath had penetrated. Even after the state that issued it ceased to exist, the oath continued to structure memory and explanation. It became the primary narrative through which individuals understood their past. In this sense, breaking the oath was not a single act. It was a prolonged psychological process, one that many never completed. Some attempted to reframe the oath as coerced. Others minimized its significance. A few confronted it directly, acknowledging that they had surrendered moral autonomy in exchange for belonging. These admissions were rare and often accompanied by visible distress. To fully break the oath required dismantling the identity built around it. That dismantling was painful. It required admitting that loyalty had been valued above humanity, that obedience had replaced judgment, that the oath had not protected honor but consumed it. For many, this realization came too late. The oath had promised clarity, purpose, and belonging. It delivered certainty at the cost of conscience. Once sworn, it did not merely demand obedience. It reshaped perception itself. Right and wrong became irrelevant categories. Only fidelity mattered. This is why the question of responsibility after the war proved so complex. Legally, the oath had no standing. Morally, it had devastating power. Courts could declare it void. Judges could condemn its consequences, but they could not erase its psychological imprint. Breaking the oath was not like breaking a contract. It was like dismantling a belief system that had replaced all others. For those who had sworn it, the oath did not end in 1945. It lingered in memory, in language, in silence. The Reich collapsed quickly. The oath endured. And that endurance explains something essential: why so many participated, why so few resisted, and why obedience persisted, even when obedience no longer made sense. The oath did not remove choice. It made choice unbearable. That was its true function. And that is why it remains one of the most dangerous tools ever employed by a modern state. When the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, its physical structures disappeared with remarkable speed. Ministries dissolved. Orders ceased. Symbols were torn down, burned, buried, or hidden. The state that had demanded unconditional loyalty simply stopped existing. But the oaths did not vanish with it. For the millions of men who had sworn personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler, the end of the war did not bring immediate psychological release. The promise they had spoken was not tied to victory or survival. It had been framed as absolute, timeless, and sacred. The death of the man to whom it was sworn did not automatically nullify it in their minds. This created a profound dissonance. Legally, the oath was void. Politically, it was meaningless. Psychologically, it remained intact. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, Allied forces encountered a phenomenon they had not fully anticipated. Many captured soldiers, particularly former members of the SS, did not behave like defeated enemies. They were not relieved. They were not grateful. They were often disoriented, silent, or emotionally flat. Some appeared calm to the point of detachment. Others oscillated between shame and defiance. Interrogators quickly noticed a pattern. When asked about ideology, many claimed disillusionment. When asked about crimes, many claimed ignorance or distance. But when asked about loyalty, the answers became rigid. The oath remained the central reference point. Former SS members repeatedly described the collapse of the Reich not as liberation, but as rupture. The structure that had given meaning to their actions was gone, but the internal framework that justified those actions remained. They were left with loyalty without an object, commitment without direction. This condition produced a strange psychological afterlife. Some attempted to transfer loyalty to abstract ideas: Germany, comradeship, sacrifice. Others retreated into silence, avoiding any confrontation with their past. A smaller number clung to the oath openly, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the post-war order. But even among those who rejected National Socialism after 1945, the language of obligation persisted. They spoke of having been bound, of having no alternative, of having promised. These were not legal defenses. They were confessions of internal captivity. The Nuremberg trials exposed the limits of this logic. International law rejected the oath as justification. Personal responsibility was restored as the central principle. The world insisted that obedience did not absolve guilt. But for many defendants, this framework felt alien. They had been trained to experience loyalty as moral truth. The idea that loyalty itself could be criminal was incomprehensible. This gap between legal reasoning and psychological reality was never fully resolved. Judges could condemn actions. Sentences could be imposed. But the internal architecture of obedience was harder to dismantle. In post-war interviews, some former SS men described recurring dreams in which they were still standing in formation, still hearing the words of the oath, still waiting for orders that would never come. Others reported persistent anxiety when confronted with choices. Decision-making had been outsourced for so long that autonomy felt dangerous. A number of psychological evaluations conducted in the late 1940s and early 1950s noted this phenomenon explicitly. Former SS members often exhibited traits associated with extreme dependency, difficulty assuming responsibility, discomfort with moral ambiguity, and a tendency to seek rigid structures. The oath had trained them to surrender agency. Its removal left a vacuum. For many, that vacuum was filled with denial. Denial took several forms. Some minimized the oath, claiming it had been routine or meaningless. Others reframed it as coerced, despite evidence that it was embraced voluntarily by many. A few insisted that loyalty had been honorable, even if outcomes were tragic. These narratives served a common purpose: preserving a sense of self that did not collapse under moral scrutiny. To fully confront the oath required acknowledging that obedience had been chosen, not imposed, that it had been internalized, not merely enforced, that loyalty had been valued above humanity. Few were prepared for that admission. The broader German society also struggled with this legacy. Post-war reconstruction emphasized economic recovery and political stabilization. The psychological dimension of ritualized loyalty was rarely addressed publicly. Discussions focused on ideology, propaganda, and terror, all real but incomplete. The oath remained an uncomfortable subject. It suggested that ordinary people had not only obeyed, but believed. As decades passed, memory softened. The oath faded from public consciousness, replaced by more abstract explanations. But its influence lingered in subtler ways. In the reluctance to discuss personal responsibility, in the tendency to frame participation as inevitability, in the persistent phrase, "There was no choice." Yet history shows that choice always exists. What the Reich accomplished was not the elimination of choice, but its psychological sabotage. By transforming loyalty into a sacred obligation, it made choice feel illegitimate. Moral hesitation became betrayal. Reflection became weakness. Autonomy became danger. This is why the oath remains one of the most instructive elements of Nazi rule. It demonstrates how a modern state can bypass law without abolishing it, can erase conscience without banning it, can secure obedience without constant violence. It shows how ritual, when combined with authority, can reshape identity itself. The Third Reich did not rely solely on fear or ideology. It relied on promises that could not be taken back. When the Reich fell, those promises did not dissolve neatly. They lingered, in language, in memory, in silence. They shaped how individuals explained themselves, how they remembered their actions, and how they avoided confronting them. The oath outlived the state that created it, and that endurance is its most disturbing legacy, because it reveals a truth that extends far beyond Nazi Germany. When loyalty is framed as sacred and unconditional, it ceases to serve society. It begins to consume it. What began as a vow ended as a prison, one built not of walls, but of belief. And prisons built inside the mind are the hardest to escape. The Third Reich did not invent loyalty. It did not invent oaths. It did not invent ritual. What it did was far more dangerous. It removed the limits. In most societies, loyalty is conditional. It exists within law, tradition, and shared moral boundaries. It can be questioned. It can be transferred. It can end. When those limits exist, loyalty serves a purpose. It holds institutions together without consuming the individual. The Reich dismantled those limits quietly, methodically, and without resistance. By transforming loyalty into a sacred vow, it shifted obedience out of the legal realm and into the psychological one. Once loyalty became personal, absolute, and irreversible, it no longer required constant enforcement. It began to sustain itself. Men were no longer ordered to obey. They protected obedience. The oath did not merely bind individuals to a leader. It rewired how they understood responsibility. Law became secondary. Morality became negotiable. Identity became dependent on fidelity. Once that transformation was complete, violence did not need to be justified. It only needed to be aligned. This is why the most devastating crimes of the Reich were often committed without visible hesitation, not because those involved were incapable of doubt, but because doubt had been redefined as betrayal. The oath did not erase conscience. It overruled it. And when conscience is overruled often enough, it stops trying. After the war, the world focused on ideology, propaganda, and terror. All were real. All were lethal. But none were sufficient on their own. The deeper mechanism, ritualized loyalty, remained largely unexamined. It was easier to condemn beliefs than to confront the reality that ordinary people had surrendered moral autonomy willingly in exchange for belonging. That exchange is not unique to history. Whenever loyalty is framed as sacred rather than conditional, danger follows. Whenever promises are elevated above judgment, systems become immune to correction. And whenever identity is tied to obedience, disobedience becomes psychologically impossible, even when it is morally necessary. The most dangerous systems are not those that threaten punishment. They are the ones that convince people there is no self outside the promise. The Reich did not rule by command alone. It ruled by binding men to vows they could never undo. And that is why its legacy endures. Not as a warning about one regime, but as a lesson about power itself. Because when loyalty becomes a weapon, it does not point outward, it turns inward. And history shows that once that happens, the damage does not end when the state collapses. It lingers, in silence, in justification, and in the unspoken belief that obedience was inevitable. It never is.